Good afternoon, London, and good morning, Toronto. Welcome to this NLA City Dialogue webinar on high-rise housing in London and Toronto. I'm Federico Ortiz. I'm head of content at NLA, and I'm delighted to see so many of you joining us today for this conversation. So we are NLA, London's Built Environment Community. For those of you who are not too familiar, perhaps with us or joining us from Toronto or elsewhere in the world today, you can join NLA, become a member of the NLA to access to hundreds of events like this one, research reports, exhibitions. If you are visit us at the London Centre that you can see here in the virtual background on my screen. Yeah, you can check our website, nla.london, for more information. So this event is part of our NLA City Dialogues program, which brings together speakers and audiences to foster cross-city dialogue and learning between cities. So today we will hear from London and Toronto and explore challenges and the future, and discuss the future of high-rise housing. So we'll be looking at both cities in terms of housing and tall buildings, and experts will discuss how tall buildings can better accommodate the needs of residents and what does a successful high-rise housing look like. So there will be a chance to ask our speakers some questions. So you can use the Q&A button or function here on Zoom throughout the call, and I'll come to those questions at the end. So now I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Kath Scanlon, Distinguished Policy Fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE, who will tell us more about the recent publication, What is the Future of High-Rise Housing? Over to you, Kath.
Thank you so much. The video has disappeared from my screen. There we go. That's me. There we go. So thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to try to give you a picture of high-rise housing in London in just a few minutes. High-rise housing is a relatively new phenomenon in London, at least in the private sector. Most private housing in London has traditionally been in the form of houses with gardens. And on the left, you see a picture of a kind of typical neighborhood of South London with terraced houses, that is, row houses that share a side wall and little gardens at the back. This is very common and still most of the housing stock in London looks a bit like this. On the right, though, we see what the kind of thing that is being built now. I took this a few months ago from Platform 4 of East Croydon Station, which is a major transport hub in South London, that's now being surrounded by residential towers. A lot of the new buildings going up in London are tall buildings. And when I say tall buildings, I'm talking about the NLA defines those as 20 stories or more. That might not be considered very tall in some places, but certainly in the London context, it is tall. This is number 1 Blackfriars on the south bank of the River Thames, just by Blackfriars Bridge. I'm so sorry, the slides are not advancing as I would wish. There we go. And this is Lewisham Gateway, which is typical of a lot of the developments that are going on around transport nodes in Zone 3, which is one of the concentric circles of transport, the transport network of London. Very high density, lots of towers. This has been under development for 20 years and is now almost complete. So why has the built form changed so radically? Well, I don't think that there's been any shift in the preferences of local people. If you look at what people say when they're surveyed, most English people and most Londoners say that they prefer to live in a house with a garden if they had a choice. However, there is an increasing role of investors from overseas buying new build flats, and many of them come from places where it is more common to live in flats. But the main factor, one of the main factors is that the demand for housing has gone up because the population has increased. It was 6.8 million in 1991. I did this slide a couple of weeks ago, and it was projected to go over 10 million by 2035. But the Center for Cities, respected think tank about cities, reported 3 days ago that it already has gone above 10 million. So population has gone up quite a bit. Attitudes to tall buildings have also changed over the last decades. On the left, we have a picture of Ken Livingstone, who was the first mayor of London after the creation of the Greater London Authority. And he loved tall buildings. He thought that London could not be a genuine global city to compete with a place like New York unless it had skyscrapers. So he really pushed for a change in the planning rules to allow skyscrapers. Before that, the rules were very restrictive as to where tall buildings could be built. And also, just as an example of the kind of influential thinking around how we should build cities, this is Cities for a Small Planet by Richard Rogers that argued for densification in existing city centers. There's also the planning system. It generates a force towards taller buildings. On the left, you have a map of the green belt around London. This was put in place after World War II and basically stopped the lateral spread of London at the existing margins of the built-up area. So there are streets where there's a row of houses on one side and there are horses in a field on the other side, because that's the edge of the green belt. No spread is allowed into the green belt. On the right, you have a table that appeared in the London Plan a few years ago, which is called the density matrix, and it showed the allowable residential density depending on the level of accessibility of each scheme. Partly because of advice from some of my colleagues at LSE, who said that in practice, the density matrix was ignored. The density matrix has been done away with. So now there is no planning limit in place on the density. And of course, beyond a certain density, the only way to get denser is to go into towers. So I should say that I'm not an architect myself. I'm an economist and planner. And so one of the things that interests me and my research group is well-being and high-rise housing and high-density housing. And we've done some research on this, partly sponsored by the Mayor of London. So in terms of what's good about living in high-rise housing, there's lots of pluses, that potentially more green space is freed up because the footprint of the building is smaller. Good views, they're often in very central locations. Easy maintenance because the homeowner or the resident only has to deal with what's inside their own home, and less fear of crime. But the research has also shown that there are some minuses about living in this type of housing. It's widely seen as unsuitable for families with children, largely because there's less opportunity for outdoor play. Surveys do indicate high rates of fear and stress and anxiety, not only from people who are afraid of heights, but just more generally. And sometimes there's evidence that there's not much of a social community developing in these buildings because there's not much interaction within the buildings, especially between residents who live on different floors. Having said all that, so that was talking about the kind of existing research. Most of the studies were done in other countries, not in the UK, and the older ones focused on social housing towers rather than private or mixed tenure towers. So we did some research in 2019 for the mayor, and we looked at 11 new schemes, of which 6 had tall buildings. These were mostly in the eastern part of London because that's where this kind of development is happening at the moment. So I won't go into the details of what the schemes were. You can look at the report if you're interested in that. And we surveyed the residents who were living in these schemes, and we found that on the whole, they were mostly young. So 71% were aged between 20 and 40. There were small households, so only 13% had children. compared to 31% for all households in London. And we asked people what they liked about living in X in the name of their building. And you could answer anything they wanted. The most common choice was modern, which is interesting because it goes a bit against the received wisdom that English people prefer characterful old buildings. I'm going to skim quickly over some of the more detailed findings. You can have a look if you're interested in the research itself. The red bars here indicate schemes with towers. So suggesting that people who lived in schemes with towers compared to other high density mid-rise schemes were more likely to not know other people in the scheme, less likely to want to stay in that building for a number of years. And when we asked people where they intended or where they preferred to be living in 10 years' time, and again, they could, this was a free text response, they could answer anything they wanted. The most common choices were spacious garden and house. So suggesting that they did not want to be living in the kind of high-rise flats where they were living at the moment. In terms of family living, 78% of the households had just one or two people, so adult households or some single parents. And even though the planning rules required that developers provide some family-sized units, which is what they're called by the planners, with of a number of bedrooms that would accommodate families, there's no way to require that it is families that occupy those units in the private housing. So family-sized units were overwhelmingly occupied by couples or by single people sharing. The parents that did live in these schemes said they were good places to raise families, but the childless people generally did not. So I'll say a little bit about another piece of research that we did more recently into a different subject, looking at leaseholders, and then I'll conclude. Last year, so first thing to say is that almost all of the new high-rise housing that's currently being built in London is mixed tenure. And that means that the private units are owned in a kind of condo arrangement as individual flats. And there's some social or affordable housing normally located in the same building within the tall building, but sometimes in another building that's part of the same scheme. So the condo owners are called leaseholders because the freehold is owned by the developer originally. And because this is a relatively new kind of building, or at least building this scale of blocks, and this many of them, it's not really a familiar way for the British homeowner to own housing. So we surveyed respondents from 50 tall buildings or high-rise and high-density buildings, mostly in London. One of the things that the leaseholders have to pay is a service charge that allows for management and concierge service if there is one, and so on. And the median service charge we found was £208 a month, with a very big range. And interestingly, more than 2/3 of those who responded were quite unhappy or very unhappy with the management of their scheme. Now, I should say this was not a random scientific survey. It was a survey of probably of people who were more likely to complete it if they had something to complain about. But in any case, it indicated that there are some areas of concern. Their main complaints were the lack of responsiveness of management, that they had little information about expenditure, and they had no control over what happened to service charges. And in some cases, they had tripled or more since in the relatively short time that people had owned their flats, and poor workmanship. So I'm working with a number of architects now, and we are trying to get some funding for more detailed research into this topic, because if this is a building type that we're going to be depending on more in future in London, we do have to get these things right. This is a book in which we put forward our findings. And I want to thank the researchers who helped me with this work. Thanks. I'll hand back to you now, Federico.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kath. That was a really great introduction to kick us off. There's a lot there that we can kind of unpack in the discussion. But now we'll stay here with London, on the London side, and I'd like to introduce Tom Stoneham, Senior Development Manager at Hub Residential. So Tom, over to you.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you, Kat. That was very interesting. I think quite a lot of what I'm going to talk about dovetails nicely into your slides. So Hub are a living space developer based in London, but we work across the UK in key lifestyle cities. Although the core body of our work is based in London, we work with institutional capital to build best-in-class rental product of all different types of rental tenures and typologies. And this afternoon, some people I'm going to be talking about 3 case studies of our schemes, 2 of which are now completed and 1 of which is just starting construction. Now, this is a view of East London, and what I learned in the book that Kath has just put up on screen is that actually 34% of London is classed as open space, which is something like 53,000 hectares of green land, which is quite interesting because often lots of people think of London as a very dense urban environment, but actually you can see from this image that it's all about pockets of density with kind of sporadic high-rise buildings. The next image shows that even more. So this is looking west from a borough called Tower Hamlets. Tower Hamlets has the greatest density of tall buildings in London, but it also has the least amount of open space per habitant, with only 17 square meters of open space. And then if you contrast this to Bromley, which is another borough of London, which is in the southeast of the city, which has 259 square meters of open space per habitant, you kind of get this picture of how London is actually a very diverse kind of mix of different areas. And this rather abstract image kind of starts to show that actually London isn't one big kind of metropolis city. It was once upon a time a series of small villages which all have amalgamated together to create this kind of diverse melting pot of different locations and different urban centres. Each of these villages has its own characteristics, its own unique kind of qualities which have become London in itself. But now the city as a whole is governed by the GLA, the Greater London Authority, as Kath said, and you have 33 different boroughs. Now, each of these different boroughs has their own politics, they have their own policies, and those are then overseen by the GLA and the Mayor of London. So you get this really kind of unique scenario where no 2 boroughs in London are the same at all. And so development and planning within London is really complex, challenging, and you have to have this kind of multi-layered approach to bringing forward a scheme. The GLA sets its London plan, which is kind of revised on maybe a 5-yearly basis, maybe a bit longer than that. And then each of the boroughs is expected to draft its own local plan as well. And often you find that one of the documents is superseded more regularly than the other, or that they don't directly talk to one another and policies are maybe slightly out of date. But within each of the local plans that the boroughs are expected to bring forward, they are supposed to identify areas where tall buildings might be appropriate. And that is quite an interesting item because, for example, Kath had that slide of East Croydon Station. Croydon is renowned for tall buildings, and one of the case studies I'm going to talk about is in Croydon. But around East Croydon Station, there is a high density of tall buildings because that's where the borough has allocated the tall building zone to be. But some boroughs do like tall buildings and some boroughs don't. And so there's this kind of quite multi-layered approach to planning in the city. And then if you overlay over the top of that, you've got central government who sometimes play kind of political games, but this is a quote on the top right corner of the screen that said tall buildings should be appropriate within clearly defined areas as determined by the boroughs. So they were placing the emphasis back onto the local authority to decide where they wanted tall buildings. Now, coming on to Hub. So Hub has, as I said, started based in London. We've been going for about 12 years. And our core kind of acquisition strategy was to buy sites close to really good transport nodes. And initially we bought sites along the Crossrail route, which is the new tube network, which has been introduced in the last few years into London. But then since then, we've also bought sites elsewhere. But the kind of fundamental thing to the way we buy sites is that they're always within close walking distance to a key transport node or tube station or train station. So all of our sites are located, all of the previous Hub sites were located within zones 2 to 6, which are the kind of core residential areas. More recently, we've got a new development acquisition strategy, which is looking at repurposing the existing buildings. So we're actually looking in zone 1 for the first time, but that's quite unusual, and that's a specific strategy which is kind of looking at how existing buildings which are no longer fit for purpose can be reused. So the 3 schemes which I'm going to talk about today are highlighted in orange. So we've got one in West London, one in South London, one in South East London, all of which are within 500 meters of a good tube or transport network. So the first project is Queen's Quarter. Now this is located about 500 meters from East Croydon Station. It's 513 homes, 51% of which is affordable housing. And the interesting thing about this site is that actually it's an island site. It's very rare in London to find yourself working on an island site, which is kind of surrounded on all 4 sides by roads. But what this site enabled us to do was to master plan the whole area. So what you can see from the plan is that actually more of the site was given over to public space and open space than was developed. And that kind of narrative and juxtaposition between the open space and the buildings allowed us to put the buildings more densely close together, because we were giving something greater back to the kind of community and the people who lived in East Croydon. And this park, which is just to the north of the site, is called the Queen's Gardens. Working with the local community, we did a co-design exercise where we invited people in to come and tell us what they thought the garden should be, how it should be, and then working with our landscape architects, who are called Grant Associates, and our architects, AHMM, we kind of developed a scheme. We presented it back to the local community and refined it with them. And the kind of outcome of that was that this park has 1,300 square meters of play space for children, which, as Kath said, having play space and things like that outside of apartments is amazing, because it kind of draws families in and makes people want to stay there. The next thing to say is that actually between the 4 buildings is a kind of really strong public realm that with high quality materials, with mature trees and kind of proper greenery designed in and around that, because people love to have mature trees around their developments. It's really important to make the development kind of feel homely and kind of planted in where it is. But also that the buildings, the architecture of the buildings is designed to be completely tenure blind from the outside. So all 4 blocks have this kind of super grid elevation approach, which is very Misesian from Chicago, but you cannot tell from the outside which of the 4 blocks might be affordable housing and the different types of tenure of affordable that there are here. It actually is the case that 3 of the 4 blocks are affordable housing, with the black block, which is on the kind of in the background of the image on the left, is the build to rent. So that's the private rental building, which is owned by Legal & General. So yes, Legal & General own that building, 251 homes, and they have an on-site team who manage that on a 24/7 basis. And that means that if residents have a problem or something like that, then they can go down and talk to the team. They can deal with issues, but also that the team on site are there to foster and generate this community between the residents. And using the amenity spaces which are placed within the building. So on ground floor, first floor, and then level 35, we have different amenity spaces that the residents can use free of charge, no issue. They just go in there, they can take their friends, they can work there. And it's a place outside of their apartment that they can use, that they can hang out. And then as I said, the people who work in the building, who manage the building on a daily basis, they actually host events in there that are all free of charge, kind of bringing that community together. And then on the top of each of the 4 buildings, there's also a roof terrace. So this is the image on the left here is the roof terrace on the top of the Fold building, which has got amazing views of South London, 270 degrees all the way around. And that can be used anytime, day or night. So the second case study, which I'm going to talk about, is called Abbey Place. It's in Abbey Wood. This is our scheme, which is closest to a tube station. So Abbey Wood is at the southeastern end of the Crossrail route. And this scheme is kind of a marker for that station. It's in Abbey Wood, there's not too many tall buildings at the moment. And so this scheme really stands out on the kind of horizon as being a marker for where the station is. It was earmarked in the local plan by Greenwich, the borough, as the location for a tall building. So we worked with ShedKM, the architects, on this to kind of bring together 2 blocks. And this scheme actually has 74% affordable housing in it, with 245 new homes. And you can see that there's a link block between the 2 kind of parts of the tower. And on that, we have a podium space, which has children's play space, as well as some soft and hard landscaping. It's worth stating at this point that all of Hub's projects have fully non-combustible facades. It's absolute paramount to Hub is that we are at the forefront of regulation and making sure that we're kind of pushing the boundaries on doing the right thing and making sure our buildings are as safe as possible. And so in the wake of Grenfell, we have kind of made sure that every single component of our facade is fully non-combustible and fully compliant, and that's really important. And if the scheme has to go through development and change to make sure that it's compliant into the future, then that's something which we look to do. And then here's an image on the left of the inside of one of the apartments, kind of near the top of the building. So all of the apartments have a concrete soffit, which enables the thermal mass to do the heating and cooling during the summer and during the winter. We have also designed it with kind of passive house design standards where possible, so that we're reducing solar gain and making sure that overheating doesn't happen, which is now a new regulation which has been brought in under building regs as well. So yes. Then the third of our case studies, which I'm going to talk about, is Yard House. This is in White City. So this is in West London in Zone 2. So it's Hub's most central co-living scheme at the moment. We've just started on site 6 weeks ago. So we're really excited to see this one come out of the ground in the next couple of years. So this is 209 co-living homes and then 60 affordable homes for Women's Pioneer Housings. Women's Pioneer Housing are a charity which focuses on delivering homes specifically for women who might be vulnerable or who need a kind of step up in the world and push on into a professional job or things like that. So they have a specific register of people who apply to them. And this scheme is work in joint venture with Women's Pioneer, brings forward the opportunity of a high density scheme in a really well connected location near to basically 3 different tube or overground lines. And this scheme, as I said, is a co-living scheme. So we've been looking at co-living for a long time, but trying to understand how it fits into the kind of sphere of rental product in the UK. It's a relatively new rental product in the UK. And so lots of different local authorities are taking their time to get to grips with it and truly understand it. But from our perspective, we think it works really well. It sits really nicely as an opportunity for those people who might be staying in a city for 12 months and they kind of know it because they're on a secondment maybe, or people who are in a transitional period in their lives. And lots of people think that co-living is specifically for kind of young professionals, but we don't believe in that. We actually think it could be for anyone. And I think it's the important thing about co-living is that you've got to design the amenity spaces to actually add something to the private spaces. Obviously, the private spaces in the scheme are smaller than if you were doing a traditional residential scheme, but it's the kind of the sum of the greater parts is having all of the different amenity spaces. So in this scheme, on the ground floor, we have a gym and various different lounge spaces. And then on level 7 in the middle here, you have dining spaces, private dining spaces, shared kitchens, there's kind of quiet lounges, there's more fun lounges to have. And then on the roof, we've also got a number of screening rooms and kind of a game space and things like that. So it's kind of giving people this opportunity to meet each other, create their own little community here. And the building will be managed 24/7 by a kind of on-site team who are specialists in managing this type of product. We've been working recently with MVRDV, who are world-renowned architects who come up with some quite crazy ideas, but we've been working on this idea of how do you actually really kind of enhance the co-living typology, push it to its absolute boundaries, and then work out how to kind of build that within the regulation that currently exists in the UK. It's a really interesting project that we've been working on. We're kind of keen to see how far we can take it. Then my final slides, which are just 2 more images of the Wood Lane project. It's all about giving back land. So where we can give something back to the community, we will. So the image on the left is a semi-public garden space that creates a level access route. The site here has quite different levels across it, and it's a well-trafficked route that goes between White City Station and Hammersmith Hospital. And so by being able to kind of re-landscape the site behind the building, we've actually created a DDA compliant ramp which goes all the way down, which means that people with pushchairs or wheelchairs are actually able to get through that landscape podium space and down to the lower level to kind of shorten their journey to the hospital. And then the courtyard space, which is created by the 2 sets of dual aspect wings, looks into that and gives it passive surveillance. And we think it's going to be a really nice space which kind of gives something for the residents in the scheme, but also gives something for the members of the public. And yes, that's the end of my slides. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tom. I think now we have a brilliantly presented, very good picture of the complexities of building tall residential buildings in London. So now we will go to Toronto, and we are delighted to be joined as well by 2 speakers. We'll start with James Parag, Manager of Urban Design in the City Planning Division at the City of Toronto. So over to you, James.
Thanks very much, and I'm pleased to be here to talk a little bit about our city. Just advance my first slide. So the first project is just a mixed-use project, which you've seen on the cover of all of the intro slides. That includes commercial, residential, and retail. So it's an interesting typology. So Toronto is located on the north shore of Lake Ontario, one of the Great Lakes. And if we zoom in on the city, we see that structure of the city based on our official plans, that we have a downtown on the lake, but we also have other centers which we're targeting growth. And you'll see that translated in the official plan map that you see here, where the orange is downtown, red are centers, and then the olive color is more mid-rise buildings, but punctuated with tall buildings as it relates to transit station. The cover of our official plan is on the upper left. We also have tall building guidelines, mid-rise guidelines, which are form-based codes, but we also have guidelines for growing up, families with children, and we also have guidelines for pet-friendly guidelines because, of course, there's an ever-increasing population of pets in these new communities. This is just an understanding of our growth 3D model, city's 3D model, about 15 years ago, and this is it today. So you could see that change, right? That drastic change. And how we accommodate this growth but still maintain a high quality of life is something that is very much part of our challenge as planners. You can see some of the examples of tall buildings, and of course there are many. Our tall building guidelines and some images are on the upper left, where we try to regulate things like separation distances, and also how buildings meet the street and how they actually form a continuous public realm. Interesting project on the lower right by PDP, an Indigenous hub, includes housing for the Indigenous community and a medical facility. But it's also about this, how tall buildings meet the street. We have a program called 1 to 50. I think we were the first municipality, at least in North America, on the lower left, that asked for larger scale elevations, including the materials label, so we can actually see how the buildings meet the street. We're also proud of our PUPS program, privately owned, publicly accessible space, that looks at how buildings meet the street, but also how they create and frame new open spaces and greenery, which is very important from a livability perspective. We have green standards that talk about improving the environmental quality of tall buildings. Of note is in the middle image is our green roof bylaw, which occupies the roofs with underused green space, but helps with ecology. And also incorporating heritage is also important. We, of course, don't have the heritage fabric context as you do in London. So we value what we have, and we try to incorporate that as we can in new high-rise buildings. Also thinking about how buildings meet the street, but also their function in community. So this set of buildings includes, for example, a new school, kindergarten to grade 8, in a heritage restored building, new grocery stores, but also a major community center shared by the community at large, which includes large pools that you see on the upper right, but also gymnasiums and various meeting functions as well. Those are the sort of ingredients that it takes to have a thriving community. A couple of case studies now. I'll just talk about 3. One is City Place, a neighborhood of about 20,000 residents just west of the downtown, walking distances, centered around an 8-acre park, but it also has 2 schools, another community center, a library, grocery stores, and retail. There you see it almost in its completed state, and you could see the major park called Canoe Landing at its base. Some of the lifestyle images talking about sports fields associated with the schools, concerts that happen. You can see the library and also the community center on the right, and the Central Park on the upper right. Another is Villiers Island, which is being created right now, a 2017 image, in which now we're working on upping the zoning and upping the density, which you see the graphic on the upper left. But again, we'll include a school, affordable housing like the previous neighborhood that I mentioned, a new river valley which is being carved out and filled as we speak to actually create this island. And there's some graphic images from about 2 weeks ago showing the island being created and filled on the right-hand side, and then some of the imagery about how it will actually contribute to the city. And then lastly, a community called Mixed Use Community. This is an older image called East Harbor. We often refer to this as our Canary Wharf, which includes a mix of housing based on a transit facility, which is one of the major transit hubs just east of the downtown, which you can see in the background here. Staff worked, sketches on the right were with city staff, how this neighborhood will look and feel, and also how the streets will be, and then also thinking about, this is the first site plan application we have, which is office, but the rest will be, the next one we have is residential. So again, creating that mix of uses, and this one framing the new transit station. So that's just a quick overview. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much. I think there's some very interesting parallels already there between Toronto and London. We'll come back to those, but now we'll hear from Richard Witt, principal at PDP, as well to expand on Toronto. So over to you, Richard.
Great, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone, or morning for me. I'm Richard Witt, principal at BDP, operating as BDP Quadrangle in Toronto. Quadrangle was established in 1986, and for about 5 years ago, we joined BDP as the first North American studio. We're about 230 people in this location, and we now also have a new New York City location, which I'm actively involved in growing. So what is going on in Toronto? James spoke to this, the recent growth of Toronto. I'm going to add some kind of construction industry numbers to set a context for those that don't know the growth of the city over the past 25 years. So in 2000, city was about 2.48 million people, the Greater Toronto Area 4.38 million. That's grown almost for next year to 2.9 million people, and about 6.5 million in the Greater Toronto Area. Sales prices and construction prices and land prices, have really kind of climbed in a crazy way. These are more anecdotal than hard numbers, but in 2000, prices were selling. Residential construction was selling for about $250 a square foot. Construction was about $150 a square foot, and land was selling at $20 a buildable foot. That's now up more like $1,500 a square foot, probably I think even spiked higher than that. It has now dropped a bit. Construction's at $450 a square foot, and land, in around 180 a buildable foot. That varies. Those vary obviously a bit on the location within the city, especially the sales and the land prices. It tends to be construction's pretty consistent across the whole region. Now I know that I should mention at this point, I know that you're doing a funny kind of metric imperial combination like we are, and I think we're doing it in different things. So we do operate in metric, but for some reason we talk about costs like sales in square feet. So sorry about that. I also want to say historically there's been something like 60 to 80,000 new residential units a year delivered, but like every city, it seems we're in the middle of a housing crisis. Our innovation team studied a political promise to deliver 1.5 million homes, and discovered that in the kind of usual Toronto-style single family detached house format, which covers a lot of the city, if we were to keep building like that amount of homes would cover almost the entire province. Ontario is about 1 million square kilometers, which is 7.5 times the size of England. So it's safe to say that high-rise housing is here to stay. In our Toronto studio, I'm one of 7 principals, primarily working on multi-unit residential buildings. My team alone has about 20 million square feet of current work across all stages, of which 2.5 million is currently under construction. So this slide isn't comprehensive. It's a small snapshot which talks to the scale and type of what's happening, from tight urban sites of 100 units on main streets to adaptive reuse projects into residential, single towers, multi-phase tower developments, and intensification of existing residential and retail assets like pad mount shopping centers or housing estates. You may have noticed that when I was talking about the stats, the growth split of the city versus the Greater Toronto Area, a huge amount of that growth is occurring outside the city proper, such as in what I've labeled here, which is a place called Vaughan, just north of the city of Toronto. I'm going to use this to illustrate a trend of what's happening in what are the former bedroom communities all around the city of Toronto, constrained by a semicircular green belt, with the bottom of that semicircle being the lake. In approximately the center of this image, the Toronto subway was extended for the first time outside of the city and a transit-oriented plan was crafted for this area, which is a 432-acre Vaughan Metropolitan Center. At that time, occupied by light industrial and big box retail. The build-out's projected to house about 25,000 people, which is about 50 40-plus story towers. We currently have about 10 of those on the boards or under construction. This is one version of how it might look. This is taken from a few years ago. I'd say there's probably about 25% of this is built already. There's one tower here which for me stands out more than the others, sort of center left. I'll come back to that later. But I want to talk a bit about from an architect's perspective or a builder's perspective how it's being done. Housing is product. For us, it's brought to market by people who intend to make money from that product. It's being sold or rented to people who will spend a huge amount of their lives there. And so a delicate formula is established which balances performance, costs, and risk. Tom mentioned non-combustible facades, and I know at Grenfell's a big discussion in the UK. Our building code, in my career anyway, has always required that. So all facades are non-combustible, along with 2 exits are required. Those exits have to be pressurized, and buildings are also sprinkled, along with a host of other measures to ensure fire and life safety. All right, I keep double clicking to click, and it keeps going twice, so it gives you a little sneak preview. I hope it's teasing. For our clients, one of the key metrics of is building efficiency. How much of what's being built is being sold. We've researched extensively into the drivers of this and of other efficiencies. We believe, I think, that money should be spent where it can be seen, where it adds value. A badly planned layout or a poorly resolved structure means less money for the facade, or for the lobby, or for the amenity spaces. And we're always looking for ways to innovate. This is the tower I just sort of mentioned in the Vaughan Metropolitan Centre, under construction. The local industry is heavily commoditized. Understanding how the systems in place can be repurposed and used is the best chance of affecting widespread change. This building shows, it's a 60-story tower in the center of Vaughan Metropolitan Centre. It has a pre-glazed facade, pre-glazed panelized facade, eschewing the glass box vernacular, which you see ubiquitously throughout the city. This enables superior quality, performance, and speed. Each floor, for example, takes a single day to enclose, rather than 4 days more commonly spent, and a far superior building envelope. Which brings me to all of these buildings. What's the carbon impact? How can we reduce it? The City of Toronto Green Standard and the subsequent kind of municipalities around Toronto are kind of following in varying degrees of speed. But the City of Toronto Green Standard in version 4, which is about to which is now in force, is one of the most progressive in North America, with a tangible pathway to zero emissions. The key metrics of that are lowering measurable total energy use intensity targets to lower energy use, thermal energy demand intensity improvements, which are created through better building envelopes, reducing greenhouse gas intensity through low carbon fuel and reduced building emissions. Our pathway to achieving these targets is in building smarter structures and reducing concrete and alternative structural systems, in prioritizing and optimizing the building enclosure. And for the third of those, luckily in Ontario, we have a very clean grid in terms of carbon emissions. So at least 91% of that comes from renewable sources, less than 8% coming from fossil fuels. So electrification of buildings is the trend that we're working towards, but often still much cheaper at the moment to use natural gas. So it's a common, frequent discussion. Unfortunately, the impact, though, of those ambitious standards is taking a while to be felt, as buildings take years to approve and procure, and years more to actually construct. We are implementing the sustainable design principles in most of our projects, including this one in Toronto's former brownfield waterfront. Targets Passive House and LEED Gold. Certification for Passive House is being targeted, which is enabled by implementing a self-supporting exoskeletal balcony structure with a simpler, high-performance facade in behind. And projects like this, multi-building net zero carbon community, intensification of an outdated office complex in the west end of the city, which is transit adjacent. The next frontier is embodied carbon. Most of the discussion about green standards has to do with operational energy, but embodied carbon is more and more becoming part of that discussion. As you might imagine, there are a lot of trees in Canada, and though as a country we're not leveraging that resource to the extent possible, mass timber is increasingly being constructed. We have several mass timber projects underway at the moment, including this 91-unit, 12-story residential building in a Toronto West End protected major transit station area, PMTSA. A breakdown of that can be seen in this embodied carbon life cycle assessment, broken down by material in the pie chart on the right. So these are just a few examples. 7 minutes isn't a lot of time to get into what is a very kind of deep topic, but the kind of work that we're also engaged in that I'm not going to be able to get to, things like family-friendly design that James mentioned, the Toronto Growing Up Guidelines. How can we ensure quality of life as more and more families move from detached homes to apartment form, and how can we make it affordable, which is a separate but related discussion. Amenity space is required in Toronto, generally at a ratio of 2 square meters indoors and 2 square meters outdoors. You know, we have a lot of thoughts about that. It's a constant discussion, which forms a big part of our sales platform. Here you can see a pool from one of the rental buildings that we completed recently, and that seems quite stereotypical, but there's often movie rooms, co-working spaces, pet spas, climbing walls, gyms, lots of other things. Accessibility is something that we're really passionate about. We're all temporarily abled, so the saying goes. This dual 22-story tower development capitalizes on a growing need for accessible housing in a region to the east of the city, which has a wait list of over 18,000 people. So it goes well beyond the building code requirement for 10% barrier-free units to 100% of those units being barrier-free, 15% of which are at a higher standard called Access Plus, along with many other building features. And that extends to the design of the units themselves. These two are examples of an accessible unit program. You can see features in the left, like the roll under sink. Toronto is a big, diverse city. How can we provide housing options for everyone is a question that we're always asking. And here's just some examples of our innovation group. There's constantly research underway, so hopefully more to follow. And here is the view from our Toronto studio, the image that you've been seeing of the well, which James mentioned, which has been the sort of backdrop to all of the slides. Our office is on the 20th and 21st floor of that office tower, and that's a view to the downtown core. Thank you very much for your time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. I would like to remember everyone watching today that we'll have some time for questions, for Q&A in a second. So now I'd like to bring all the speakers together, but first I'm pleased to introduce Emma Talbot, Director of Regeneration and Development in the London Borough of Harrow, who will also be joining the panel discussion. So we'll start with you, Emma, with a question around the kind of the current context and the critical, obviously, housing crisis here in London. We heard about it as well a little bit in terms of the Toronto side of things. But from a local authority perspective, how can tall buildings better accommodate the needs of local residents? And how can we ensure that high-rise housing generates benefits to the local community?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I've been sort of fascinated listening in here, and so many similarities actually between London and Toronto, but also, you know, the ambition there to actually, it feels, to put residents and the future residents at the heart of it. And, you know, in terms of when we think about, you know, how they can better accommodate the needs of residents, I do think that's the key to it. Actually, is that where we start planning places from, about the people who are going to live there, the experience of living in a building. And, you know, when I was sort of thinking about this, and I know Tom mentioned it, you know, I'm going to give a plug to what Kath's done as well, because I've got my copy in front of me, because it's a really, it's just, you know, really thought-provoking about those small details that make something livable, and how we build with the future in mind, the future of people and their lifestyle. And the fact, I think from a borough perspective, we want people to stay in our boroughs. We want them to thrive there, and we want them to have access to opportunity. But so many times when we're, you know, talking about height and tall buildings, and, you know, I have a planning background, and, you know, from a plan making perspective, we're chasing a number. We're chasing a number with finite land. And we are optimizing growth in certain areas. We may soon be maximizing. You know, there's going to be some reviews going underway of that. But so much of the discussion is about viability, and that's driving height rather than lifestyle and quality. And I think we've got to really put people at the center of it if we want development to deliver from then. And there's so many examples of things that have been built with great aspirations, but we've not necessarily delivered on the quality and the mix of uses. And I do, you know, what Tom's talking about with co-living, with build to rent. You know, Kath brought up an example of Lewisham Gateway, which I worked on for nearly 20 years in my time at Lewisham. Also a development with a new public park, moving a couple of rivers, also an island site as well, surrounded by roads, but actually build to rent as a product where it's not just about a number of units and people staying indoors, but about having access to facilities as part of the development, and then making sure that the local community feels that that's also part of them. And I think how that becomes a bit more cohesive. So yeah, you know, a lot of food for thought, and I can see the direction that we're going in around design codes. And you know, but I think that from a London and from a UK perspective, so much is around, you know, a debate over the color of a window and the type of brick. You know, as for, you know, a type of guidance around, you know, family living. And you know, this isn't a flippant comment, but pets. Actually, when I've done consultations before, the amount of people who say, well, I don't want to live there, I can't have a pet. And actually the quality of life that brings, particularly to an older person, you know, how we're creating with that end user in mind, I just really think is key if we're, you know, if we want to deliver for them.
Absolutely, that's really, really great. Thanks so much, Emma. So I think I'd like to bring everyone together, but I'd like to elaborate a bit more on that point, because there seems to be something around, I think, two things: how these high-rise residential buildings create a vertical community within itself, how people are more connected, but then also how can we ensure that it doesn't become a vertically gated community to the surrounding people, to people are living around those areas and local communities. So where are we seeing some good examples, some innovation around this? And this is both for Toronto and London, or elsewhere as well in the world where we can learn from. So who would like to expand a bit on that first? James, you're on mute.
Knew what happened once this session. Happy to weigh in on this, you know, and as somebody who actually lives in a tall building. So I live on the 50th floor of a tall building of a mixed-use complex. We have a grocery store downstairs, and we're 2 blocks from the waterfront. We live with our daughter, who's now grown, but we've often always lived in a high-rise neighborhood. And for us, it was more about choice and quality of life than anything else. You know, we know our neighbors. We have co-working spaces. I have a dog, so you know, going down 50 floors in an elevator is not a big deal, and for 3 walks a day, and it's something that we believe we can have a very high quality of life. You know, we live again close to a transit station, so but we do own a car, but we live close to a transit station, so we can get anywhere downtown. You know, it's an interesting story when my daughter turned 13, we thought, let's move into a single family house. And because it's closer to a certain school. And she said very quickly, Dad, I don't like it here because I can't walk anywhere. And I thought that was an interesting comment. You know, we've since then moved back into the downtown. But for us and for many, it is a quality of life issue, it is a livability issue. And for some, it's also an affordability issue in terms of starter home and building equity. You know, the majority of what we're seeing is condominiums, and condominiums are serving as the rental stock as well, because people are renting out their units. That's starting to change. We're starting to see more and more applications for actual purpose-built rentals, and Richard showed one.
Excellent. Tom, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, from a hub perspective, when we're thinking about bringing forward a planning application, first and foremost is research and public consultation, and understanding what do people in the local area want and what are the needs of the people who already live there, because you don't necessarily know who's going to move into your building. But what you do know is the people who already live there. And so go and ask them questions. So we always consult as widely as we can. We talk to thousands of people in all sorts of different ways, be it roving exhibitions or actual kind of permanent exhibitions or online forms for people to fill out. But it's all about finding out what are the people who live there already missing from their local community. And if they give you the idea of, well, actually, we don't have a good coffee shop, put that on the ground floor of the building. It turns your building from basically a dead front door where people just come and go to a building which actually lives and breathes on the street. It has a relationship with the pavement. And that's something which is really important, is actually making sure that the ground floor of your building is open to the public, that they don't just feel like it's a shut front door. So all of our schemes that we're bringing forward now across the whole of the City of London have some kind of third-party use of some sort, be it a cafe or a gym or a co-working space in the ground floor, which means that members of the public can interact with the building. And so it doesn't just land there and sit there kind of quietly, but actually it kind of becomes part of the community.
Yeah, and if we kind of go beyond that and we think about social infrastructure, and I think Richard mentioned a case study where there was a school as part of a tall building example. Who should be deciding where this social infrastructure is? Is it part of the developers, the local authorities, or the city, to make sure that it's any project is maximizing that kind of local benefit or contribution that it's doing to an area?
Tough, isn't it? I mean, as a residential living space developer, it's really difficult to be able to kind of bring forward a new school. But on our larger schemes where the scheme can afford to give something greater back, we always try and do that. It's what you find with London, though, is it's a really difficult kind of balance between buying the land, which is extremely expensive, and getting a lot of space. You kind of you always, the density of what you're putting on the site is always really challenging. And so the schemes like Queen's Quarter, where you have the space to give something greater back, is much easier to do that. So it's kind of a challenge on a location by location basis, but also it's bought by the local plans of each of the boroughs, I would say.
Yeah.
Maybe I could just add to that, Federico.
Yeah.
These 2 points are absolutely correct. The local council or municipality for us, I think, is responsible for identifying where there is a need for school, but is a school which generally is a fairly low density occupancy, is that the highest and best use for a site, particularly in a tight urban condition. So that's why you may end up with deals being made between developers and tenants of a school, so you can maximize both things. You'll see in other more mature tall building cities like New York, where there are schools on the rooftops, with outdoor space, which I've seen. I think that coming back a bit to some of the conversation earlier, though, James has been a champion, I think, for the past at least 20 years for the city of understanding that the space between buildings, that the public realm is really the key to the quality of life in tall buildings. So this thing about pets, I mean, I don't have a pet, maybe because I'm highly allergic to dogs, but I've always found it very amusing that we have pet friendly guidelines for the city, and I'm led to believe that there are as many dogs as there are people in Toronto. So for a city which is substantially filled with tall buildings, I would imagine James must be stuck waiting in the elevator for the dogs going up and down for walks every day. But initiatives like what's happening at the ground floor, like Tom said, what is the first 5 stories has been one of James, and I think to Toronto's benefit, what's happening in that area in the public realm. In contrast, I think, to historical high-rise housing developments in the 60s or the 70s, they tended to be internalized communities built as an estate or as a series. The kind of tall buildings that we're not talking about, the kind of tall buildings that we're talking about are not that. They're being integrated into city fabric. And so the amenity where you want to live is the city. So we don't want to drive people into internalized communities. I think we want people to experience the city and all that it has to offer while living within it.
I'll just pick up on that. And, I did show a couple of examples where we have new schools as part of proactive planning, right? We're getting this many people. We need to plan for schools. One of them is actually in a renovated heritage building at the base of a 70-story tower. And that's connected by a bridge to the community center that I showed, just opening. So again, thinking of proactively is something that's really important. In terms of community schools, but also parkland, right? How each development can pool open space so that we do have many new parks in the city and in our growth areas. I have to add a little bit of color to Richard's comment about pets. We often say that in every floor of a residential tower going up, we'll probably have 2 pets. And one of the things that we have to be conscious of is what is their impact on existing parks? And there's always been struggles with off-leash areas, and so managing the pet population on site is something that was very much part of thinking behind our pet-friendly guidelines, right? So having spaces in buildings for pet washing, for example, but also having dog relief spaces means that the dogs don't have to go into the public.
Right, and I think there's clearly something here about obviously quality of life, but I'd like to go back to this point around family-friendly high-rise buildings. And Kat, maybe you can expand on this, on the recommendations that were part of the book in terms of planning and policy here in London, because it sounds like maybe compared to Toronto, there's some things that London is lacking in that sense.
That's absolutely right. I think Toronto it sounds like it's made a kind of political decision that families should be accommodated in these kinds of homes, and they want to make them good long-term homes for families. And maybe it'd be interesting to hear if the families of Toronto are indeed moving to these new buildings in significant numbers. Here, I think there's a bit of a divide. There are some boroughs like Tower Hamlets, which Tom mentioned, where there's a lot of new high-rise housing, and it's some of the most active development in London, where the borough has done quite a bit of research and found that there are a lot of families living in high-rises, not through choice, or not all through choice, but because they don't have any other options, and they're often overcrowded. They complain of, the children don't have a place to study. The younger kids can't go outside because there's no adults to supervise them, and so on. And so they I guess they see their role or the challenge for a local authority of addressing the problems of families living in high rises because they don't have any other choice. But there are, at the same time, a lot of planning guidance and negotiations with local authorities for new schemes are around what kind of provision there will be for families. So, nice play spaces and landscaped areas and so on. And one of the things that makes this kind of thing much easier is if the site is big enough to allow for proper master planning, like the Croydon example that Tom showed us with that lovely play area. And we found in our research a few years ago that those people who were living in master plan schemes were much more likely to say that they wanted to stay in the long term than people who were living in kind of single, we called them urban insertions. So basically a tower on a constrained site with no green space and no outdoor realm.
I think there's obviously something to say about the difference, obviously, in the history of both cities, but the land and the size of the land that is available in London is obviously very different compared to Toronto, and it's greedy nature, I guess, in a way, so that adds complexity to London. But I don't know if you like, from the Toronto side, if you like to expand on families, have you done any kind of research or heard back from families? What's the feedback in general from your policy?
So largely high-rise living accommodates young people and seniors, right? Both ends of the spectrum. But there's a growing number of people that want to, they liked living in high-rise density, and they don't want to give that up. So there are a growing number of people, they meet and then they have a family and they want to stay in downtown. So again, having that percentage of housing that is the sort of 2%, 20% roughly of units that are 2-bedroom or 2-bedroom plus is something that can accommodate that. And then we have to look at the infrastructure and thinking about those things that, like parks, schools, that can accommodate families with children.
Yeah, maybe I could just add to that. The obvious tension in family-sized living is that family-sized units are bigger, which means that they're more expensive. So as the housing prices have gone up, spectacularly, there's a gap where people can't afford $1.5 million for a house, but a condo of 2-bedroom condo is also going to be pushing $1 million as well. So it creates a lot of tension, and trying to think of ways to accommodate that is a constant thought process. We have done in lots of projects through the there's a question about amenity space which has been asked. I would say we rarely exceed the amenity space requirements in projects because that's a function of this efficiency ratio, but 2 square meters per unit is actually quite a lot. And we see often a lot of that amenity space devoted towards family, like a playroom or outdoor play areas or things like that. So these things come up, and there are ways through that program to supplement, the local park facilities and create space. But it's also about thinking, where do we put the pushchair or the stroller when you come in, which in a typical residential design is quite tricky. I have seen a lot in the second bathroom of a 2-bedroom unit, which is a shower. People keep the stroller in the shower, which is quite odd. But I think there's a small amount of thought which can be given to unit design, which can accommodate these sort of things. And I think that's the way it's going, and that there is going to be no other option. So we have to accommodate families in high-rise or at least multi-story units.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'd like to pick up actually the point of obviously affordability. So maybe we start with the London side of things, because Tom, I think you mentioned a scheme where you had 75% of.
Yes, Abbey Place. Yes, so that was where it was a unique funding structure with a CBRE who came forward and they wanted to operate it as affordable housing. So they actually converted what was the private space in the scheme and kind of flipped the 2 blocks over. So at one point, the larger block was going to be private and the small block was going to be affordable. But actually, the way that they were using things like grant funding and their own funding structure and the kind of a long-term sustainable growth of rents for their fund, it actually made more sense to increase the amount of affordable housing in that scheme. But I've been reading the Q&A question about amenity space. And I think it's really interesting because if you think about build to rent, it's actually not been around in London for very long. It's probably been around for maybe 12, maybe 15 years at maximum. And so it's genuinely in its infancy still. And I think the initial schemes which were developed, Hub did one of the first forward-funded build-to-rent schemes. It was called Rehearsal Rooms in North Acton. And that scheme doesn't have very much amenity in it at all, because at the time, people didn't really think that amenity was important to that. But we're now probably in our 3rd or 4th generation of build-to-rent. And some schemes kind of it's almost like this race for amenity. It's like an arms race for amenity, particularly there's a scheme up in Manchester, which has something like 5 square meters per apartment, which is just like a ginormous amount. But if you then think about what that does from an operational cost, to operate those spaces, to clean them, to light them, to heat them, and then what do you do with the space? Do you have a swimming pool? Well, that only goes on the bottom line of the rents for the people who are living in that building. So it's a really interesting kind of question about, well, actually, at what point do you have too much amenity? And at what point is the cost of operating that amenity eroding the income so highly that actually the rents are being pushed up for the residents? And it's kind of that balancing point is still being found, I think, in build to rent.
Yeah, so just to mention the question to everyone. So the question was for London, are amenity spaces regulated in tall buildings by local planning authorities? If not, which factors determine the provision of indoor amenity space within new builds? So maybe Emma as well, for you in terms of the local authorities, and maybe is it part of your local plans, or how is it impacting BTR and co-living or examples, your local plans?
So, I mean, the London plan, and for a long time, has set out sort of play guidance, and we've got amenity space guidance. But I think probably what we're talking about here is something that goes beyond that, because we've been doing that for a long time. And if we're talking, carrying on that thing of families, it's not really, made much difference. I mean, my experience is the same as I think when Kath was explaining it. If you put in a 3-bed unit into a high-rise scheme, it's generally sharers. There's not many families there, and we're seeing that throughout London with the roll on schools reducing down to the point where schools are closing in some boroughs because there aren't as many children. And those are in some areas that have undergone some quite big estate regeneration that were quite high-rise buildings but had children in them. I'm a kid from southeast London. My friends lived in high buildings. That was normal, but it was a very different type. That was sort of a council house as opposed to private, which is more, I think, has traditionally been focused on the size of your balcony. And therefore, is that really usable amenity space? So I think that we've got better with the generosity of space within units. I don't think I've ever had an architect come to me and talk about pram storage, but those are the practical things about exactly that make something livable. Where I have seen more of a change, though, is in build to rent and also co-living. And I think post-COVID, more people working from home as well, actually the co-working space. And how often we used to be told that, well, office space isn't viable. And now actually, what makes you live in this tall building versus the one next door? It's the experience of living in it. And so I do think that has value. And when it has value, it starts being added in. And what I think we just need to be careful of is that for a lot of the time, the shared and communal amenity space that might be part of that vertical living, and therefore and hopefully available to others as well, doesn't erode the size and the quality of the individual units, which I think is, we would want both. We would want a really good living environment where you can create a community and where you get to know your neighbor and where you feel part of the place. Because I think that's really what we want. And therefore, with some of those wider mix of uses as well, not a private gym, but one that is open to the public. So there aren't really the set guidelines, but I do think on that when you have the forward funding model of a build to rent or co-living, where you're taking a long-term income stream, actually, I think it comes back to better management and therefore more interest in creating that lifestyle, which I think can only benefit the end user and be therefore sort of welcomed by a local authority.
Thank you so much. I think that's really good. And then we also have the kind of similar question for Toronto. So do the municipal regulations and guidelines for amenity space play a strong role in the design and provision of amenity space?
Yeah, so as Richard mentioned, right, we do have that guidance of both indoor and outdoor amenity space. And we often see that is changing, right, in terms of what that amenity space is changing. And now, a modern building will have, co-working spaces. That seems to be the big trend these days, post-COVID especially. And also pet-friendly areas, swimming pools, health clubs, all of those things that promote that sort of lifestyle, but also promote that kind of livability. And the market seems to somewhat dictate that. But the city does play a role in terms of guiding those spaces with some of the background documents that I spoke about.
Could I just add also a point of clarification, something that Emma said? When we're talking about amenity spaces, we're not talking about balconies. Balconies are part of the private space, and you know, in Toronto, having balconies is the norm for every residential unit. And whether or not that makes any sense is a debate that we can spend the rest of the year on, because the salespeople demand them for sales, and then when you look at them, nobody ever uses them. But amenity is, you know, big outdoor areas with adjacent indoor areas and other communal areas which cannot be privatized throughout the building. So you can't Sorry, go ahead, James.
Sorry, so I have to weigh in on that, Richard. You know, I think post-COVID, we've all learned the value of having outdoor space, right? When we were all stuck at home for a long time. You know, I myself, you know, really enjoy my balcony. Again, as I mentioned, it's on the 50th floor, especially, of course, in the warmer weather. But throughout the year, I will actually grill or barbecue out there. Have my Weber grill, and it's something that I frequently use out there. So Richard is right. You know, sometimes you often see, you know, bike storage, for example, out on the balconies. But I do think more people use their balconies than people believe.
Okay, so James and I are going to have an offline arm wrestle about this issue later.
I think it is. I mean, it's a very heated debate as well here, balconies in general. But that probably could be a whole event on its own. I'm gonna pick another question from the audience around construction, and both here in London and in Toronto as well. So, what are the challenges, and I will add as well, opportunities or innovation that you see in construction for tall buildings and residential tall buildings? And maybe I'll loop in this question around floodplains. Is that an issue, and is that a challenge in terms of construction of tall buildings? Who would like to pick that first?
Why don't I just start with the floodplain question, and then I'll hand it over to Richard in terms of the construction question. But one of the projects that I showed, Villiers Island, $1 billion plus of public infrastructure money spent to create that island, largely because of the flood protection of the east side of downtown. We have a river called the Don River, and you know, it had been prone to flooding. So in order to unlock that neighborhood for development, that area in the Portlands and that area in the southeast portion of our downtown, we needed to have a strategy for flood protection. That's exactly the solution. So it is a legitimate issue here.
Richard, in terms of challenges I've seen in construction, I mean, that's going to take us a while as well. I think you know, ground conditions, soil conditions, bearing capacity, speed, availability of trades, construction cost increases. So many. There's always challenges, but somehow we seem to have great clients who seem to overcome them. So.
And do you think MMC, modern methods of construction, or other types of innovation in terms of construction is helping with any of that?
I'm not familiar with that term, so it's hard for me to say.
That's probably a very London term, I guess. Then, so any new ways of building, I guess. We did have a discussion last year around timber construction in tall buildings, which I know is a whole different debate. But yeah, modular construction or any other types of innovation around construction. But I don't know if Tom, if you want to.
As a kind of, maybe I could just say before you go, Tom, as a kind of blanket statement about the situation in Toronto, it's been such a booming market for 2 decades that there has been very little innovation in the way that things are built, because the issue of risk and certainty, especially surrounding price, governs over, hey, maybe you could do this quicker, but then when you try and get tender prices on it, well, maybe I could do that, but that's not what I'm set up to do or what I'm normally doing it, so it's more expensive. So I think I'm hoping that many things will come. Timber definitely is getting bigger and bigger, but it's still quite fringe, and you know, in 80,000 units a year, it's probably, you know, 1,000.
Yeah. Tom, would you like to?
Just the construction questions are so many different angles to go at. So in terms of MMC, there are obviously really good examples of where MMC has worked. there are also many examples of where it's not working. And so it's really difficult. You see so many MMC modular construction businesses which seem to be struggling to make their finances work because you put such a amount of investment in at the front end, and actually if you can't get the factory working as efficiently as it needs to be, then the output and I guess this is probably a problem with the expectation that people are going to get planning and start on site super quickly is just not the reality in London. But as I said, there are examples of 2 towers down in Croydon, which are both modular and have flown up and seem to be really good quality. So there is examples of positive examples of MMC. In terms of timber, we'd love to use timber, but no one in the UK will touch a residential building made of timber at the moment. Well, sorry, above a few stories. So it's that's a challenge. Hub does actually have a timber building which we built back in 2016 before it was an issue, called the Boiler House, which is in Hayes, but that was only, I think, 5 or 6 stories. But yes, that has its own challenges because you now have the whole EWS1 form and things like that, which have been introduced since then. But in terms of construction costs, it's just so difficult. COVID was the first one, then the Ukraine war, and costs just seem to be going up and up and up, and now plateauing, but they never come back down. And so it's this challenge with, I don't know, I think rental growth in London has kind of paced at the same rate as construction costs, so they've kind of balanced each other out, but at some point it's probably going to break. And I think the risk which gets placed onto the contractors is quite high, and the level of information which they're expected to produce is vast, be it to sign off planning conditions during the construction process on things like contamination of the ground or anything like that. And now the information which is being required to discharge the gateway system, which is the new building regulation system for high-risk buildings, which are any residential building above a few stories with residential units in it. You have to go through what's called Gateway 1, 2, and 3, and Gateway 3 is actually really, really challenging to get through because the information that the contractor has to pull together to hand over to the regulator at practical completion is kind of going to cause lots of delays to projects. So it's really challenging building at the moment.
Right, thank you very much. I think we're almost up to time. So I'd like to bring the conversation to a close, but I'd like to thank all our speakers for today's conversation. That was really great. We also wanted to mention that obviously, as every year, we are launching our Tall Buildings report next month on the 25th of April. So we'll continue this discussion around high-rise buildings. And we will now have a short poll for the audience to give us some feedback on the session. But again, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks to our speakers and the audience, and see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So at the end. See you soon, James.
Take care, Richard. Should get together soon.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Pleasure meeting you.
Yeah, you too.